Welcome to another Pure Read audiobook. It's wonderful to have you with us. Before we get started, please like and subscribe to our channel and share it with friends. Supporting us in this simple and easy way ensures we can continue adding more delightful audiobooks for your listening enjoyment. The following story is copyrighted Pure Read Limited, the home of books you can trust. Now, sit back, relax, and enjoy.
Rose Red, Loving the Injured Duke, Regency Romance by Charity McCall. Chapter 1. In Deep Trouble. This wasn't a good sign at all. Normally, he and Clarissa spent the day down at the docks on such a warm and cheery day. The sight of so many soldiers around their normal rendezvous point meant that his mission had been compromised. He didn't believe in coincidences, and being alert had saved his life more than once. The best thing he could do was to slip away, and he did just that. Finding his way to Avenue Troyes in the middle-class section of Paris was easy for Edward Gillen. The 26-year-old man slipped through the back gate of the small but beautiful house. He paused in the shadows when he saw that his mother had guests. No need putting her in danger also, especially since he had no idea who the guests could be. He hadn't come here straight from the docks, just in case someone was watching or following him. He had made a lot of turns. Only when he was sure that there was no one following him had he made his way to his mother's home. By then it was growing dark, and with his dark clothing, he couldn't be easily spotted, but he needed to get closer to the house so he could find out who the people in his mother's house were. The backyard was covered in rose shrubs, and it was easy for him to crawl on all fours until he was directly below the living room window. I'm telling you the truth, Madame Eugenia Gillen-Dubois was telling the two gendarmes who were glaring at her. Her heart was pounding because she knew her son was in great trouble. Hadn't she warned him about getting too close with that French woman? If you don't believe me, you're free to search through my home and compound. Though she was French, she spoke perfect English and insisted on doing so now. Everyone knew that she'd been married to an Englishman, so she had no reason to pretend that she didn't know the language. Besides, she wanted to put two men at a disadvantage. "How many rooms does this house have, and do you have a cellar?" one of the men asked. "You're free to go through every room and turn everything upside down if you want. My son is an adult and no longer lives at home with me. He's out fighting the Emperor's war, and why you're here bothering me is something I don't understand. We have reason to believe that your son is working for the British Army as a spy." Eugenia threw her head back and laughed. "Whoever told you that is a liar. Edward was born in France, and yes, though his father was an Englishman, he chose to live in France. This is where we brought up our son, and he's never once set foot in England. Not all Englishmen are loyal to their country, and my son is a good person. He's dedicated his life to serving this country, and for you to call him a traitor and a spy is really shocking. If we weren't at war, I would march to the Parliament and demand that you apologise for this slight. We know that your son has been meeting with a number of English army officers. Is it wrong for that to happen? Don't the French officers also have friends among the English? Meeting in public places doesn't necessarily mean that someone is spying on the French. What if the reverse is true, that Edward is spying for the French army? My son is advantaged enough to speak both languages fluently, and he's been working as a doctor in the Paris Metropolitan Hospital. Why would you think he would now have turned into a spy? We have it on good authority." "Oh, I see." Her sardonic tone made Edward smile. "A bitter and scorned woman comes to you with a silly story about my son being a spy, and just like that, she snapped her fingers. You think he switched his allegiance to his mother's country? Is this how the Emperor is now fighting his wars? Using embittered women who aren't even soldiers to falsely accuse those who are loyal to him?" "Madam, we're sorry about all this misunderstanding." "You're free to go through my house and find out if my son is here," Eugenia insisted. "After all, let it never be said that Madame Eugenia Gillen was uncooperative to the French police," she said. "My allegiance is to my country, and so is my son's. If my husband was still alive, he would declare the same. We're sorry to have troubled you." Edward heard them leaving, but remained in the shadows for another 10 minutes before slipping into the house through the back door. "I wondered when you would be coming in," his mother said softly, even without turning around. He was always surprised at how she could always tell when he appeared, no matter how silently he did so. Even as a child, very little would get past her. What's going on, Edward? Mama, I don't know. He came up and kissed her on the cheek. Clarice sent me a message for us to meet, and when I got there, found the place crawling with the police. We're at war, just in case you forgot. Yes, maman, but I would expect to see soldiers, not the French police. I immediately knew that something was wrong, so I fled. What did those men want? They were searching for you, and it's only a matter of time before they find you. Eugenia turned troubled grey eyes to her son. We need to get you out of Paris very fast. Why did you ever think you could be friends with that unstable girl? She was a means to an end, dear mother. Well, she might just be the means to the end of your earthly life. I warned you about playing with the affections of a young and impressionable girl. She expected you to propose and marry her, but you've been stringing her along. She was here yesterday sobbing her heart out and telling me that you had said you weren't ready to settle down. Mother, as you so rightly pointed out, we're at war. Who has weddings and all the trimmings on their minds right now, when all we can think of is how to escape from this madman's influence? Be careful how you speak. At least right now the servants aren't here because I sent them away. I'm finding Paris to be a really uncomfortable place to be in right now, and was thinking of going to the south to stay with my friends for a short while. I'd like to go to Cannes-in-Provence, which is still loyal to the Bourbon monarchy and one of the least likely places for Napoleon's influence. I'll stay there until all this is over, but my worry is for you, my son. I could always go back to work but join a different troop. Eugenia shook her head. The fact that those men were here to search for you means you've been compromised and can be arrested or killed at any moment. I need to get you out of France. She held her hand up when he opened his mouth. For once, Edward, listen to me. You're my son and I love you very much. The last thing I want is for you to be killed in a war that isn't yours. I warned you about that girl, but you wouldn't listen now it's come to this. We can't be sure that Clarice is the one behind all this. Eugenia turned her eyes to him, and he squirmed. Even as an adult, one look from his mother was enough to discomfit him. Pray tell me, who else would have the knowledge that I'm your mother? I haven't lived in Paris that long and don't have friends here who can associate you with me, except of course that young lady. You were careless to bring her to my home when you knew nothing about her, and now she's using that against you. I'm really sorry for that, Mother. At the time, I thought I was doing the right thing by making her feel comfortable so she wouldn't suspect that I work for the British Army. That's all in the past now. I have to make arrangements to get you out of Paris and very fast. Where would I go, Mother? I've never been to England. You're a trained spy and luckily look so much like your father that you could easily pass for an Englishman, which you actually are. Your father's family name is Channing and they live in Pentonville, Cumbria. That's in the north, west part of England. Your father always boasted of Cumbria's beauty and I went there only once. It's isolated enough for you to be safe, but not quite cut off from the world. You'll be safe with your father's family. What if they don't welcome me? What then? Eugenia shook her head. When your father was still alive, he often communicated with his brother who begged him to return home. But my Paul was a very proud and stubborn man. She had a faraway look in her eyes and Edward put his hand around her shoulders. He knew how much his mother missed his father, who died 2 years previously. I'm sorry, Mama. She touched his cheek. I will only rest easy when I know that you're safe, Edward. You need to get out of France right away because you're well known, and that Clarice woman will go to any lengths to have her revenge on you. I can't lose you too. Her voice broke. I hear you, Mother. Make whatever arrangements you have to. I'm ready to go if that will make you happy. It will. It will. Chapter 2. The Injured Stranger. Gently pulling the weeds out of her mother's small vegetable garden at the back of their cottage, Teresa Whiting was humming softly to herself. Gardening was her favourite pastime, and it also provided an escape from her sister's endless nagging for her to be her audience while she recited famous lines from different playwrights. Even now, she could hear Tamara trying to practice her lines from William Shakespeare's play, Hamlet. To be or not to be, that is the question. She was citing and Teresa immediately tuned her out. She loved her older twin sister, but sometimes got impatient with her. All Tamara could dream about, think about, and talk about was how she was one day going to be a famous actress. Her twin's desire was to one day go to London and enroll in one of the theatre houses and join the ranks of other world-famous thespians. While it was admirable, Teresa couldn't imagine living anywhere other than Cumbria. She loved Pentonville, their small village, and dreamed of one day meeting a fine young man who would fall in love with her and she with him. Together, they would make a beautiful home right here in Pentonville. Her own parents were happy enough, if one could call their relationship that. She'd never heard them quarrel, and so she had no idea how they ever made up when they did. One thing she believed in was being with a man who would allow her to be herself. Many times Teresa felt that her mother was holding back on being the very best she could be because of her father. Working at the large manor, which was the Duke of Pentonville's home, as a cook meant being exposed to a lot of information and activities, but her mother rarely did anything other than work. While the other servants usually took part in functions that the Duke and his mother before him hosted, Hannah Whiting preferred to return home and work in her garden. When she wasn't gardening, she would be embroidering, knitting or making quilts for sale to supplement their income. As a result, Teresa and Tamara often wondered what the manor looked like on the inside since they'd never had the chance of finding out. Once in a while, when there was a ball, and their mother had to prepare meals for the many guests, the girls would be allowed to go up to the manor to help, but were usually confined to the kitchen only. They couldn't even go into the dining hall where meals were set out for. That was the work of the other maids. Oft-times, Teresa wondered what life as a noble felt like. Even though the Duke was friendly enough, he was still aloof, and they knew their position as servants didn't allow him to interact much with them. She knew that her sister had had a childish crush on the Duke for the longest time, even though they never spoke about it. Well, her sister deserved to have her dreams, as far-fetched as they might seem. In any case, she had her own, and so didn't Judge Tamara. There was a rustle in the small copse beside the garden, and Teresa looked up, heart pounding. Though there weren't any wild animals in the woods, she was still afraid of what might emerge from there, especially now that her father wasn't home. Suddenly, a man stumbled into the small clearing, and she made a sound of fright, putting a hand to her lips. There was blood all over his shirt, and he looked like he'd been thoroughly beaten up. "Water!" the injured man gasped. "Water!" He nearly fell, but Teresa immediately ran to him and bore the brunt of his weight. "Tamara!" she called out. "Tamara, come out here quickly." "Why are you bothering me now? Can't you tell me what you want?" Tamara, her voice brooked no nonsense, and a few seconds later, Tamara emerged from the house. "What?" The words died on her lips when she saw that Teresa wasn't alone. "Come and help me get him into the store, quick," Teresa said, and the two girls half-dragged, half-carried the injured man to the store, which luckily for them was empty at this time of the year. It was a small structure that had been constructed on one side of the house by their father, who was a woodcutter, and in which he stored firewood that he would sell, or for their own use. Their father would later stock up on wood for the winter, but for now it stood devoid of anything other than a few pieces of old furniture. There was an old bed and mattress in one corner, and they placed the man gently on it. He was groaning, clearly in a lot of pain. "Tessa, what have you done?" Tamara finally found her voice. "He just came out of nowhere. What was I supposed to do?" "Do you know how upset Papa will be when he finds this stranger in our home? We have no idea who he is, and with the war raging on, we don't want to be harbouring fugitives and war criminals." The injured man muttered something, and Tamara bent closer to hear what he was saying. His eyes were closed, and he kept repeating the words over and over again. Tamara's eyes widened in comprehension as she understood what he was saying. "What is it now?" Tessa looked at her anxiously. "What is he saying?" "He's speaking French and calling for his mother, saying that he's dying, since she was aspiring to become a world-famous actress. Tamara had been teaching herself some French for a while. The large library at the manor held a number of books written in the language that were simple enough to understand. Her mother would once in a while bring her one or two just to keep her busy and out of mischief. Tamara had dreams of visiting Paris one day and acting in some French plays. This man is French. Oh dear, do you think? Teresa let her words trail away as horror replaced curiosity. He could be a French spy, in which case we need to report this immediately to the village militia or constable. No, they'll have him hanged. Do you think you can hide him here for more than a day or two? Papa is bound to find out soon enough, and then we'll be in a lot of trouble. I have to, as I work out what to do with him. Tamara shook her head. You have no idea how our parents are going to react to this man's presence. He's badly injured and could die. Do you want his blood on our hands? We're not the ones who injured him, Teresa said forcefully, though she was scared that Tamara's words might come true. The man was seriously injured, and they needed to get him a doctor. We could get the doctor to come see him. No doctors, the man muttered from the bed as he slipped in and out of consciousness. No doctors, please. His English was really good for a Frenchman, and they wondered who he was. Now what are we supposed to do with a man who doesn't want a doctor to come and check on him? Tamara asked her sister. You can be sure that we're in deep trouble. Teresa smiled. You don't have to be in this with me. We could always say that you didn't know that I had brought this stranger into the store. She stopped when Tamara shook her head. What are you thinking? We're in this together, and if for one moment you think I would let you face the music alone, then you're greatly mistaken. I wouldn't want you get involved and then get into trouble. I'm already involved whether I like it or not. Let's just see what we can do for this man before he gets any worse. There seems to be a lot of dry blood on his left shoulder, and saying this, she bent down to take a closer look. As she lifted the shirt, the man hissed in pain. I'm sorry, sir. If we are going to help you, then we need to check the wound. I'm sorry that this will hurt, but there's no other way of doing this. I'll try to minimize your pain as much as I can. All right. He opened his eyes and looked right at Teresa. Please help me. He begged and closed his eyes again. Teresa felt quite shaken at the intensity in the blue eyes that had just shut again. She'd never seen a man with such beautiful eyes that expressed so much. Teresa, stop daydreaming. Go into the house and get me a pail with hot water and soft cotton cloth. Quick, we need to see how we can patch this man up. Oh, and bring Mama's sewing basket too, and some of Papa's brandy. This man will need all the help he can get to bear with the pain. Yes, I'll do that at once. Teresa left quickly, glad to have the chance to pull herself together. She'd never been affected by a man's eyes in her life before, until just now. Who was this man, and where had he come from? What had led him to their doorstep? These and many other questions darted through her mind as she momentarily forgot what she had come to fetch from the house. Tessa! Coming, quickly picking up a pail and filling it with water from the pot that never stopped boiling, she hurried back to her sister. Not for the first time, she thanked the wisdom of her mother who said hot water should always be readily available, for one never knew when they would need it. I managed to get his shirt off, but the poor man swooned with pain. It's a gunshot wound, and the ball seems to still be inside. What are we going to do? I told you to bring me Mum's sewing kit. There's a pair of tweezers that I can use to try and pull the ball out. I'll get it. Tessa hurried out, tears in her eyes. She couldn't imagine the pain the man was in, but thankfully he was unconscious. When she returned, she found that her sister had cleaned the blood away, even though more kept replacing it. You're going to have to be strong, Tessa, Tamara said without looking at her sister, whose face was white. If you swoon on me right now, I'll get very cross with you. Pull yourself together and do something useful. I don't know if I can watch, Tess said in a trembling voice. Hold his hand and whisper anything to soothe him as I try to get this ball out. Tamara's tone was milder as she saw what state her sister was in. I'll be done in no time, so please just bear with this ugly sight for a brief moment. All right. Tessa took a deep breath as she squeezed herself to sit on the man's uninjured side. Luckily for them, the bed hadn't been placed against the wall, so there was some room for her to maneuver her slender frame. She sat down and held his hand, carefully turning her back so as not to see what Tamara was doing. It was a struggle, and at one point the unconscious man woke up, but the pain was too much, and he slumped again. He's unconscious again, Tessa announced. Which is just as well, because I think I've reached it and pulling it out requires all my concentration. Tessa wiped the injured man's brow, and a handsome face began emerging from underneath all the grime and blood. There, Tamara announced after a short while. I have the ball out, but there's so much blood, she said. I need some of Papa's gunpowder so I can seal up the wound. Go to his gun cabinet and bring me some. Yes, Teresa was glad the whole horrible ordeal would soon be over for the injured man, and also for herself. The smell of burning flesh nauseated her as her sister did the needful to stop the bleeding. Just when she thought she couldn't take any more, Tamara soon announced that all was over. Now all we need to do is get him bound up and as comfortable as we can. Thank you, Tessa said. She never ceased to wonder at the countless and daring things her sister was able to comfortably and confidently do. But the two of them, it was Tamara who liked spending a lot of time with their father learning a lot of manly stuff, to their mother's unending chagrin, while Tessa preferred to learn more domesticated chores from their mother. Tamara smiled at her sister and touched her cheek. This man has clearly made an impression on you, and I want to patch him up so he can get well. Who knows? He might just be the Prince Charming that you've been hoping for. Prince Charming rode on a horse, Tessa said, her face quite red. Her sister was right. The man had made quite an impression on her. Who was he? Even so, he might have lost his horse, but at least now he has a chance of getting better thanks to you. Sit with him for a while as I return these. She held up her mother's sewing kit and her father's brandy. I'll also find some blankets and sheets and bring them out. It's not cold right now, but the nights might be terrible for him. Tessa looked at her sister through grateful eyes. Thank you so much for doing this. You'd do the same for me if the roles were reversed. Now let me also find one of Papa's old shirts, though it will be a tight fit seeing as this man is bigger than our father. Chapter 3. Among Friends. What were the two of you thinking? Edward heard a gruff voice speaking from the other side of the wall. He'd woken up a few minutes ago wondering where he was, then he recalled the events of the past few days. After his mother had made arrangements for him to leave France, all that was left was for him to make it out of France and into England. The first part of his journey went without a hitch, and once he'd crossed into England, he didn't expect that his pursuers would still be after him. So he made the mistake of relaxing his guard, and that's when trouble began. 2 men had followed him all the way from Dover to Cumbria before finally catching up with him when his horse threw a shoe. It was 2 against 1, and he managed to badly injure both of them, but not before one got him in the shoulder. He wasn't sure if any of the men were still alive, but that wasn't his immediate problem. Surviving through the intense pain for the next few days was what he had to deal with. He touched his bandaged arm and winced. It felt stiff and he was in pain, but didn't want his hosts, whoever they were, to give him anything that would hamper his ability to stay alert and focused. Then he chuckled softly. Had they wanted him dead, they wouldn't have gone to great pains to get the ball out of his shoulder and make him as comfortable as he was right now, given the circumstances. But Papa, the man just came from nowhere, and we couldn't just let him bleed to death out in the courtyard. Tamara, how many times have I told you to be wary of strangers? This man was speaking French. What does that tell you? That he knows many languages. Edward had to smile at the cheekiness in the young lady's voice. This is no time for joking, Tamara. Why did you think it would be all right for you to bring the man into our home? Were you thinking about your mother and sister's safety? Papa! Teresa, you just keep silent now because I know this isn't any of your doing. You always think before you leap, unlike your sister here. He made a sound of annoyance. And to think that all this has been going on right under my nose for 2 days now. Why didn't you tell me sooner? But Pa. Tessa, go and check on our guest while I finish with your sister, who has really made me cross. I'm sorry your sister had to drag you into another of her messes. Just go and check on the man. Yes, Papa. When Edward heard the soft footfall outside his room, he closed his eyes and waited to see who would come in. Through a tiny slit in his eyes, he could make out that it was the fair lady who'd been in the garden when he stumbled to their small courtyard. And she was very beautiful. Her hair was almost gold and she had lovely hazel eyes. Even through his delirium, he'd noticed that she held his hand and spoke soft words to him. For the past 2 days, she would come into the small room when she thought he was asleep and talk to him in her gentle musical voice. Are you awake? He heard her soft query, but decided not to let her know that he could hear her just yet. I'm sorry if my father's noise has disturbed you. She sat down on the chair next to the bed and for a brief moment was out of his view. All he had to do was turn his head to look at her, but he wasn't ready to do so. My father is so cross because he came in and found you speaking in French. I hope you're not a spy because that would really be bad for all of us. Now he wants us to find a way of getting you out of here, but you're still not strong." She stood up and he slowed his breath, still feigning sleep. "I hope you wake up soon and are much better." She sat down again. "Papa thinks it's Tamara who brought you into the house. I wanted to tell him that it was me, but he wouldn't let me speak. Now he's angry at Tamara and it's all my fault. What do I do?" The soft cry came from her, and he made a soft groan as if he was just waking up. "Oh dear," she stood up once again and he opened his eyes. "Where am I?" He needed to know his location just in case he had to make a quick getaway. With an irate father who didn't seem like he was about to be appeased any time soon, from the scolding he could hear in the background, it was just a matter of time before they showed him the door. "Our village is Pentonville." Tessa felt like her heart would beat right out of her chest. The man's eyes were so blue, and though there were shadows in them, she still found him to be the most handsome man she'd ever seen. "My name is Teresa, but my friends and family call me Tessa," and then she blushed so delightfully that Edward wanted to sit up and just continue gazing at her face. His weakened state, however, prevented him from doing that. "My name is Edward Gillen," he said, and then raised his good hand. "Would you like me to say something to your father so he won't continue being angry at you and your sister?" Tessa shook her head. "Tamara knows how to handle our father and even mother, so I'm not worried." "Why the deep frown on your pretty face, then?" Once again, he was rewarded with a blush. "If Papa manages to convince Tamara that you have to leave, I'm afraid there's nothing more I can do." "Thank you for all you've done for me so far," and before he could speak further, the door opened once again to reveal a face identical to Tessa's, but her hair was dark and her eyes blue. They danced with cheekiness, and something within him relaxed. "Tamara, what did Papa say?" "Oh, don't mind too much about him," she grinned at Edward. "Young man, you're causing us a lot of distress and my parents are in the house wringing their hands because they don't know what to do with you. Are you a French spy?" Edward found himself grinning back, though. In his case it was more of a grimace because of the pain. "I'm half English and half French, but my allegiance lies with the Crown of England." "How sure are we that you're telling us the truth?" "I wouldn't have had a ball in my left shoulder if I was a French spy. 2 men followed me all the way from Paris and finally caught up with me at Cumbria. We fought, but they had pistols and I didn't. You're lucky the gunshot wasn't just a few inches lower, or you'd be in the ground right now. Thank you for taking care of me, and the last thing I want to do is cause any trouble for you." "Well, what's your name then?" It was Tessa who answered her. His name is Edward Gillen, but he could see the curiosity in her eyes, which had lost their fear since her sister stepped into the room. It was obvious that Tamara was the older twin and protector of her sister. "Edward Gillen, half French and half English. What brings you to Pentonville?" "My mother felt that I wasn't safe in Paris anymore." "Why?" He smiled. "I work as a doctor, or should I say worked, at the Paris Metropolitan Hospital. When war broke out, I decided to help England because much as I don't like the monarchs who ruled before the French Revolution, I like Napoleon less. For about 2 years now, I worked among the French soldiers and would get information from them and pass it on to the English officers. But someone betrayed me and my mother decided to send me to my father's family here in England to seek refuge." "And where is your father?" Edward twisted his lips. "He died 2 years ago. My mother mentioned that my father's family is called Channing and they live in Pentonville." He was surprised when the 2 girls exchanged a swift look. "Did I say something wrong?" "No," Tamara shook her head. "Your name is Gillen. Why?" "That was my paternal grandmother's surname, which my father adapted when he left England for France. I think he didn't want to have anything more to do with his family. Do you know of any Channing family that lives in Pentonville?" The girls did, but they weren't about to reveal that to this total stranger until they had checked his story out. He could be a spy and bring trouble to their village. "What else did your mother tell you about your father's family?" Edward shrugged. "We never talked about that part of my family, and as I grew up, though I was curious to know more, Mama wouldn't tell me. It was just when things got out of control that she decided to do so. But my father's name was Paul Gillen, if that can help." He fell silent for a brief moment. "Would you please help me to find my father's family? If I can do so soon, then your parents won't have to continue being so agitated at my presence here. But, Tessa started, only to be cut off by her sister. We'll see what we can do. Meanwhile, you need to freshen up, and while you do that, we'll change your bed linens. I hope you can walk on your own now. I'll do my best, Miss Tamara. Good, she turned to her sister. Go and prepare some broth for Mr. Edward Gillen while I stay out of Papa's way for some time. He'll soon calm down, and then we can have a rational discussion about what to do with our guest. Chapter 4. In Search of the Truth. Tamara, I'm really sorry that you're in trouble because of me, Tessa told her sister a few hours later. They were on their way to the Duke's manor on the pretext of seeing their mother. She'd already returned to her post to prepare the evening meal for the Duke's household. In reality, they wanted to find out if Edward Gillen's story was true. Think nothing of that, dear sister. After all, I'd like to find out more about this gentleman, and come to think of it, he bears a remarkable resemblance to Lord Arthur. They could actually pass for brothers, only that he has really deep blue eyes, whereas Arthur's are silvery grey. I didn't know that you'd seen the Duke up close. Tamara shrugged. Once in a while I've managed to sneak past Mama's strong defences and slipped into the study. I've never met the man face to face, but his portrait pictures, especially the one in the study, is so lifelike and real. I wish someone would paint me like that. It must be very expensive to get an artist who goes to such details as the eye colour. When I become famous in London, people will be queuing to do my portraits. I would hate for anyone to have paintings of me that I wasn't aware of. Well, I guess I love the publicity that comes with being a famous actress, while you, my dear little sister, are obviously quite content to stay in the shadows. Then something struck her. If what your Edward says is true, then he's related to the Duke and might possibly be titled because of his father. Just think, he might be an earl, a marquise, a viscount or a baron. You'd still be referred to as Lady Teresa Gillen. Tamara, Tessa protested weakly, feeling warm all over. He's not my Edward, and there's no likelihood of him showing any interest in me. Tamara made a sound and stopped to look at her sister. That man's eyes were following you everywhere, even though he tried to pretend not to. I think he might be interested in you, and you also seem keen on him. I didn't say that. You don't have to. It's all there in your eyes. For your sake, I pray that Edward Gillen is really and truly related to Arthur Channing, for then you'll get married to nobility, and I can then drop names when I finally get the chance to go to London. Tessa shook her head, but said nothing, for they had arrived at the kitchen door. The mother was busy consulting with the other servants, and they slipped past her and into the study. This is amazing. Tessa's eyes grew big. She'd never seen so many books and journals all in one place at a time. Does Lord Arthur ever get time to read all these books? Most are just volumes collected over the years by his ancestors, but I can assure you that the man likes to read. And how would you know that? Tamara's response was to point at the large volume lying on the desk in the study. It was open, and a few pages had been dog-eared, as if to mark them for further reading, and see how his quill holder and ink are lying within easy reach should he need them. Where is the Duke? I don't want him catching us here. Mama could get into a lot of trouble. Be not dismayed, for I found out that dear Arthur is out showing off his new pair of horses that he got just a day or two ago. That man and his horses, she shook her head. We have only about 2 hours before he returns, so let's make good use of them. It was Tamara who came across the journal, giving the family history of Lord Arthur Channing's ancestors. This is really interesting, she called out softly to Tessa. It says here that Lord Miles Channing had a brother named Paul. According to the last entries made in this journal, this Paul left his family home under a cloud and moved to Paris, where he changed his name to Gillen. Then, according to Lord Miles, he lost all contact with his brother. That's what Edward told us. Would you know the reason why Edward's father chose to leave his home for the unknown? Tamara shook her head. The journal doesn't say anything about that. What it goes on to say, however, is that Paul Gillen or Channing is supposed to inherit a duchy. What? Tessa leaned forward to read, and her sister pointed at the paragraph that spoke of a duchy in Northumberland. The Duke of Wendell was Paul's maternal grandfather, and it seems as though the lineage has died out. There are no males to take the title, and that's why Paul and his descendants are being sought, or else it will join the ranks of those duchies that faded away into obscurity. So Tessa hesitated, her heart filled with dread. There's a possibility that Edward could be a Duke. According to this journal, since Arthur already holds this particular title, he can't take on another unless there's absolutely no other male descendant in the Duke of Wendell's lineage. Besides, I doubt that one person can run two duchies at the same time. So yes, Edward is a Duke. Imagine Lord Edward Gillen, the Duke of Wendell. She winked at her sister. You'd be Lady Teresa Wendell, the Duchess of Wendell, just think. But she saw the look on her sister's face and stopped smiling. Now what's wrong? If Edward was just a simple and ordinary man, I might have had hopes and a chance. But a Duke, she shook her head. They marry among their own and rarely break ranks. I don't think I want to tell him that he's a Duke. Tessa, Tamara took her sister's hand. You've got to do the right thing and tell Edward about his title. Besides, nothing can remain concealed forever. Now that we've found the connection between Edward and Arthur, it would only be a matter of time before he gets to know the truth. I'm really scared of losing him. Dear girl, the man hasn't even asked you for anything. Tamara's tone was firm. You need to pull yourself together and not break down right now. We know the truth and need to get Edward to his inheritance. What should we do? Tessa thought for a while. She had a feeling she was losing the man she was in love with, but there was nothing she could do. He was nothing she could do. He was nobility. She was a commoner, and nothing could come out of their relationship. We need to tell Lord Arthur so he can also find out if Edward is really who he says he is. Wait, isn't there a gallery of some sort in this manor on the first floor? I think there might be paintings of Edward's father hanging there. But someone might see us, and like you said, Mama could get into a lot of trouble if we're found wandering down the hallways of the manor. Anyway, let's wait for Arthur and tell him what we've discovered. Chapter 5. Family Reconciliation. Tessa wasn't quite sure if the Duke was paying much attention to them as they told him their story. His eyes were closed, and he was leaning his head on the back rest of the large seat. He looked quite formidable, and she was trembling within because she'd never been in his presence before. From a distance, he looked imposing enough, but face to face with him, she was tongue-tied. Throwing a quick look at her sister, she was surprised to find that Tamara seemed very much at ease in the presence of the Duke. You say this gentleman stumbled into your courtyard a few days ago? Yes, Your Grace. And why didn't you immediately let me know of his presence? It's my duty to watch out for the interests and security of my people in this duchy. I have to make sure that any strangers pose no threat. Why didn't you come and tell me about him sooner? He was badly injured, and we had to nurse him back to health so he could defend himself should the need ever arise. Were you expecting trouble from somewhere? Tamara shook her head, but the man kept muttering in French and my parents thought he might be a spy or something. The look on your face tells me you believe that he's innocent of those accusations. The man mentioned a few things about your family, and we decided to investigate. Tamara ignored the Duke's comment. Well, we found out about your uncle who went to France years ago. And pray, Lord Arthur Channing opened his eyes and leaned forward, his silver-grey eyes staring piercingly at the two girls. Tessa wished she was anywhere but here. How did you come about this information? Tamara frowned at him. Is that really what's important here? We may have just found your long-lost cousin who is also supposed to be the Duke of Wendell, and all you can do is question us like criminals. Tessa gasped audibly at her sister's audacity to face the Duke and speak to him like one would appear, and shook inwardly. Her sister had really done it this time, and they were going to be in a lot of trouble for sure. Then the Duke did a surprising thing. He threw his head back and laughed out loud. You're right, Miss Tamara. I shouldn't be asking you all these questions when clearly your family is hosting a man who may well turn out to be my long-lost relative. Now this is what we're going to do. I'm coming to your house with you so I can meet my beloved cousin, if indeed he's the one, and once I confirm it to be so, he will be moved immediately to the manor. Just like that, Tessa blurted out, then blushed when his intense eyes, so much like Edward's save for the colour, turned to her. How else would you have me do it, Miss Teresa? I'm sorry, she wrung her hands, at a loss of what to say. As always, Tamara came to her sister's defence. We happened to see a painting of your Uncle Paul, who looks a lot like you do, and incidentally also Edward Orr. Should I say Lord Edward bears a striking resemblance to yourself, Your Grey? So you want me to meet this gentleman with my mind already made up that he's my cousin? My sister is asking you to keep an open mind, that's all. And why? For the simple reason that this man was badly injured and would have died had we not taken care of him. What he needs right now is peace and quiet so he can recuperate and not 1,000 questions fired at him. Very well then, Miss Tamara and Miss Teresa, take me to your parents' house so I can meet my cousin. He placed heavy emphasis on the last word. Yes, Your Grace. The moment Edward saw the visitor who'd come with Tessa and Tamara, he felt something really funny inside. It was like looking at a younger version of his father, and he closed his eyes so no one would notice the tears that were threatening to fall. Edward Gillen, I presume. Lord Arthur thought he was looking at the portrait of his uncle that hung in the family gallery. The young ladies had been right. This man was definitely a Channing, but he kept his face expressionless till he'd satisfied his curiosity. That's me, all right, but who are you? Arthur looked at the two girls. Tamara shrugged while Tessa wouldn't meet his eyes. Didn't these young ladies tell you that they were coming to find me? I knew they would eventually try to find my relations, but Edward shook his head helplessly. I didn't quite expect someone like you. I don't understand. When my father talked about his family back in England, I always imagined them to be peasant farmers or something of the sort, not this. By this, do you mean distinguished? A modern-day dandy is what comes to mind, Edward said unhesitatingly. He didn't understand why he felt quite at ease in the other man's company. Are you a noble man, or do you just like dressing up to look like Lord Arthur Wellesley? Arthur chuckled. If you didn't closely resemble my late Uncle Paul, I would say you and Tamara are brother and sister. Edward grinned at him. The only people who dress like Lord Wellesley are dandies and hold titles of some sort. Tamara felt that it was time to step in. Edward, this is Lord Arthur Channing, the Duke of Pentonville, and your first cousin. Edward's jaw dropped, and then he shook his head, grinning sheepishly. I put my foot in that one. So you did, Tamara agreed. We're actually on his estate, for my mother works as his cook. That's really surprising. I'm sorry to have caused any inconveniences. Don't worry about it. I took the liberty of bringing my carriage just in case you turned out to be my cousin. I'd like you to join me at the manor, which was our father's home for many years. If you're sure it won't be an inconvenience in any way. Believe me, it won't. In any case, you're safer with me than with this family should any trouble arise. And it's also your way of ensuring that I'm not a French spy. Edward winked at Tessa, who blushed to the roots. Keep your friends close and your enemies even closer, said the wise men of old. Chapter 6. Broken-hearted. Edward found that he quite liked living at the manor, for he found out so much about his father's life as a boy and teenager. His cousin was a complex fellow, but they also had a lot in common, like strong familial ties. It was interesting that Arthur wanted to find out so much about his father's brother, and Edward indulged him. Still, as he continued recuperating, Edward insisted that he needed Tessa's ministrations. She was my nurse, he argued when his cousin thought it wasn't wise for him to spend so much time with her. She took care of me when I was ill, and I want her to continue doing so. Is there a problem with that? Your actions might be misconstrued to mean something else. Exactly what something else do you mean, Arthur? Miss Teresa is a very impressionable young woman and might think that you're singling her out because you're attracted to her. But that I am, and I didn't think I was hiding anything from anyone. Tessa is a beautiful and gentle woman who's won my heart, and I want the world to know. I think I'm in love with her, and this is the chance for me to get to know more about her. That might not be the right thing to do, especially since you're set to take up paternal grandmother's father's title of Duke of Wendell. I still don't see what that has to do with anything. Arthur sighed deeply. Explaining things to his cousin wasn't easy, which was a stark reminder of their different upbringings. You're a duke now. That's just a mere title, but I'm still the same man inside. I wasn't brought up royalty or as nobility, but just as an ordinary common man, and all those things you say don't make sense or mean anything to me. Here in England, we have to follow the right protocols when it comes to marriage in order to have continuance of the family lineage. Edward stared at his cousin blankly for a few seconds before breaking out into laughter. Is that what you tell yourself so you can get a good night's sleep, Arthur? I'm really serious about this, Edward. You hold a title and can only marry a lady who's also titled. That's what society dictates, and it's what men in this family have been doing for ages. That madness may work for you, Arthur, my dear cousin, but I believe in love. I'm not going to marry a woman, just to please society when in the confines of our bedchambers we can barely stand each other. I'll only marry for love, title or no title or no title. You can't really mean that. You know how important this title is to the family. Our great-grandfather and then our grandmother's wish was that the title should continue in the family, and you're the best person to perpetuate it. Not if owning some title means giving up the woman I'm in love with because of some misguided notions of keeping things in the family. It's not just some title, Edward. With this title comes a commitment to the family of the Earl of Wexington, Lord Samuel Baxter, in Northumberland. Run that by me again, please. Arthur sighed, knowing that a fight was coming. In the past, the Earls of Wexington proved very loyal to the Dukes of Weldon, so an unwritten pact was made between them. Sons of Weldon or Gillen family would take brides from the Baxters. Is this written in stone and emblazoned in gold? No, it was more of an informal agreement than anything else, but the families were loyal to it. And yet the family lines died out. I'm a Channing even though the name I go by is Gillen because of my father. That pact or covenant or whatever doesn't apply to me. In any case, it's just a formality for me to take up this title. I don't have to, and don't need it for my survival. But it's what our great-grandfather would have wanted. Edward sighed. It's oppressive familial obligations like these that made my father go to France and remain there for all those years. I won't be forced into a corner on this issue, and if you want the title back, you can have it. Edward, titles can't be just handed back and forth like that. This one can, and I won't allow anyone to interfere with my love for Tessa Whiting, so you either find a way around it, or else I'm done. You don't mean that? Arthur stared with horror at his cousin. The man was so stubborn. Trust me, I mean every word that comes out of my mouth, dear cousin Arthur. You may do things rigidly here in England, but in France, things are different. Is it any wonder that the French Revolution took place not so many years ago? The simple people have every right in this world, just like the nobles. Why do you spend so much time staring out the window, Tessa? Tamara looked up briefly from the play she was reading. Edward isn't going to walk in through the door. He's a duke now and has a lot to deal with. I just wish, Tessa sighed, twisting her lips. What are you wishing for? Nothing. She turned sad eyes back to the window, and then they lit up when she saw who was coming down the pathway. You were wrong, Tamara. She stood up and straightened her day gown. Edward is here. Are you sure that's not some figment of your imagination? A gentle knock at the door belied Tamara's words, and she watched her sister through narrowed eyes as she walked to the door. Tessa curtsied and then stepped away from the door. You don't have to do that, Tessa. I'm just still the simple man you rescued weeks ago. Your Grace, welcome to our home. Thank you. Edward looked over to where Tamara was standing, an inscrutable expression on her face. He sensed her caution and smiled, feeling a little bit nervous. The girl had a stare that could unnerve the toughest of men, reminding him of his cousin. Miss Tamara, how do you do? How do you do, Your Grace? She curtsied. So we're now being very formal because you're a duke. Tamara, Tessa shook her head helplessly. Her sister was just the limit. Far from being offended, however, Edward grinned at her. A title is just that, but it's the man or woman carrying it that matters. I'm Edward to you, so no more of that. Your Grace nonsense. Reserve that for my dear cousin because he was born with it. I like you now, Tamara smiled back and he relaxed. How is life in the manor? You're looking healthy and much better. That's because I am. The doctor who Arthur insisted on bringing in to check up on me, though I tried to tell Arthur it was all unnecessary, commended your handiwork, dear girl. He couldn't believe that a woman, and a young pretty one at that, could patch up a man like you did with me. Who taught you all that? My father, Tamara shrugged, picking her book up. I'm going to the kitchen to make some tea. Would you like some? Delighted, he said, turning to Tessa once Tamara had left the room. My dear, beautiful girl, it's so nice to see you again. I've missed you since you stopped coming to take care of me too, or is it 3 days ago? You're healed now, and I didn't want to become a nuisance. Come and sit by me. He sat down on the couch and patted the space beside him, but she shook her head. My parents could walk in at any time, and I don't want them scolding me or Tamara. I hope you told your father that I mean no harm to you and your family. Mum already told him, but he's very cautious when it comes to strangers. That is quite understandable. His eyes were so gentle, and Tessa didn't know why she felt like weeping. I'd like to take you riding sometime, but only if your parents will consent to it. I don't have a horse, and neither do I know how to ride. But your sister does. I've seen her sneaking into Arthur's stables and leaving with one of his horses. Why didn't you ever learn? I guess I didn't have the interest, and I'm not as daring as Tamara is. You're just the right woman for me. He dropped his voice and was delighted when she blushed. I can't stop thinking about you, Tessa. I'd like to ask your father for permission to court you and eventually marry you because I love you so much. Do you feel the same way that I do, my darling? She nodded slightly, too shy to even look at him. Good. So do I have your permission to speak with your father? Could you wait a little while, please? Her eyes mesmerized him, and he longed to spend hours just gazing into them. Papa needs to get used to the idea of your being around, and then you can ask him. Very well then. I'll do as you ask, but under a lot of duress and protestations. I'm in love with you, and I want the whole world to know it. What about your title? What about it? Please don't tell me that you're also a snob like Arthur. It's only a title and can be accepted or rejected. Don't let it bother you too much. Now tell me what you and your sister have been up to these past few days. Chapter 7. Where is Tessa? Tessa was very anxious when she received a note from the Duke of Pentonville asking her to see him in the manor. He'd sent a messenger who had instructions to wait for a response, and she told the man to go on ahead and she would follow. She didn't want Tamara knowing what was going on because her sister would most likely want to come along too. The note clearly stated that she should come alone, so she made her way to the Duke's study once she got to the manor. This time she used the front door, so her mother had no idea that she was there. Please have a seat, Miss Tessa. You don't have to look so frightened. I don't bite. The Duke's attempt at humour fell flat. She was too intimidated to respond to any light banter. I asked you to come and see me because I'm quite concerned about my cousin. Why? Is there something wrong with Edward? That's Lord Gilham for you, for as you know, he's the Duke of Wendell. I know that. She felt quite chastened. My cousin has it in his head that he's in love with you and is giving me problems about the duchy. Tessa didn't say anything. You must appreciate the fact that the two of you were brought up in very different environments and as such would never suit as a couple. A duke's life demands so much and society expects him to marry well. Even though he didn't say it out loud, Tessa knew the Duke meant that she wasn't good enough for his cousin. She wanted to weep, but didn't want to show the Duke just how much his words had affected her. If you really care about my cousin, then you'll have nothing to do with him. Let him think that you're not interested in him at all, because this title lies in jeopardy. If Edward doesn't take up the title, then it will have died with our great-grandfather, and posterity will hold us to blame for not continuing this lineage. In any case, as the Duke of Wendell, Edward is already betrothed to Lady June Baxter, the daughter of the Earl of Wexington. It's a union that was arranged even before he was born, and this is the time for him to do the right thing. You know what I mean, and as an intelligent woman, you know that nothing can ever come of your friendship with my cousin. That's why you have to step away from any budding romance between the two of you. Very well then. Arthur seemed at a loss of words after Tessa's acceptance. She wasn't going to explain herself to the snobbish man, and all she wanted was to leave and return home. She shouldn't have even accepted to come here in the first place. Your Grace, she stood up, curtsied and left, knowing that she was being rude, but she didn't want to continue staying in the same room as the man who'd just broken her heart, so he thought she wasn't good enough for his family. Tessa bumped into her sister just as she emerged from the manor, once again through the front door. Where have you been? Edward is looking for you. I thought he'd gone to Northumberland to take up his title. He says he was on his way there, then remembered that he hadn't bid you farewell in the right way. Tamara made a funny face. I didn't know that there was a right and wrong way of saying farewell. Does he do it with bells and flowers? Stop being so funny, Tamara. Tessa had to smile at her sister's words, even though she was inwardly seething at the Duke's words. "Edward is at our home waiting for you. You shouldn't keep him waiting because he's got a long way to go." Tamara turned and Tessa followed her. She wanted to see Edward one more time, probably the last time, because she had to do as the Duke said. He was her mother's employer and the landlord, and her father's wages as a woodcutter couldn't afford them as nice a cottage like this. When should they be thrown out? "Let me go and see him then." Edward was waiting for her on the small swing set on the porch. As soon as she came into sight, he stood up and walked over to her. He didn't want anyone telling her about Lady June Baxter before he did, because he didn't want her getting the wrong idea. "There you are, my love," he said, taking her hands in his. "I didn't want to leave without telling you once again how much I love you. You mean the world to me, and being away from you for even a day is real torture." "You don't have to say all that." "Will you miss me, my love?" "More than you ever know," she half whispered. It was breaking her heart to know that he would be in Northumberland with Lady June, and they would probably get married and raise little titled children. "Then why do you look so sad?" Tessa forced a smile. "Because I'll miss you very much. I'll only be gone a few days, and just so you know, I've been asked to look up an old family friend. Her name is June Baxter and her father is an earl." He said it nonchalantly, and if Tessa didn't already know about the young lady, she wouldn't have thought much about the comment. But she did, and her heart sank further. "Don't worry before you know it. I'll be right back. In any case, I don't want the title if it will keep me away from you. Let me just go and see what it's all about, and if something bothers me, you can be sure that the title is gone from my life." And with one last gentle kiss on her upturned cheek, he got into the carriage that was waiting for him. She had to admit, being a duke suited Edward, and she couldn't imagine him not taking his title. She knew that he loved her very much and would drop the title if he could, and so she had to do the right thing. Chapter 8. Deep Despair. "Child, I love you, and it's not just because you're my brother's daughter, but because you're a good girl. But seeing you in this state is worrying me. What happened at home?" Tessa shook her head, unable to speak for the moment because she was crying so much. She'd left home without telling anyone where she was going and travelled to Willow Creek, a small village in Lancaster, to her aunt's place. This was the one place she knew no one would think of looking for her for a while, and she chose it because she needed to stay away from anything that reminded her of Edward. He was probably engaged to Lady June Baxter by now, and in a few weeks they would get married and begin their noble lives together. "Tessa, this kind of grief can only come from a broken heart, one that has been wounded by love. Would you tell your dear aunt what ails you?" She held out her plump arms, and Tessa needed no second bidding. "Oh, Aunt Janet," Tessa was so glad of the comforting arms. "I'm so sad." "Indeed you are, but this too shall pass." Janet Groening Knee-Whiting was a beautiful buxom lady of about 45 years old. People who saw the two of them together would often mistake them for mother and daughter. "There's no pain that time won't soothe, but only if you let yourself be soothed. You can hold on to the pain and live a very miserable life, or you can choose to grieve for a while and then pick yourself up and move on." Later that night, as Tessa lay in bed, she thought about her aunt's words and sighed deeply. She loved Edward so dearly and would miss him greatly, but like Aunt Janet said, life had to go on. She had to pick up the pieces of her life and carry on, and what better place than the Merry Widow Inn, which was at the crossroads to London. Her cousins Hans and Graber had offered, of course, out of the hearing of their mother, to travel to Pentonville and mercilessly deal with the man who'd broken her heart. That had brought a smile to her heart, and she knew that time would eventually heal her. Still, it didn't stop her from thinking about Edward and wishing he was close by. "Tessa, there's a guest in the small parlour who needs your attention. He seems to have come from far and is really tired. Go and find out what he needs." "Yes, Aunt Janet," Tessa said, walking towards the said room. From the moment she entered the parlour, she got a funny feeling within. Thankfully, there were other guests in the parlour, so she didn't feel scared, but the man's intense gaze unnerved her. "What's your name, young lady?" he asked, even though he wasn't that much older than her. "Tessa," she said shortly. "Welcome to the Merry Widow Inn, and I'm here to serve you." "Thank you, that's very kind of you. Now, would you get me some ham, eggs and a nice cup of tea? some fresh bread if you have any, and then prepare me 2 large sandwiches for the rest of my journey." "Very well, sir," she curtsied because something about the man made her think he wasn't quite so ordinary. She was aware of the eyes that followed her every movement as she left the room and when she returned. It wasn't that the man was threatening in any way, it's just that he seemed to know her from somewhere, but she was sure she'd never met him before. When he finally left the inn, she breathed out a sigh of relief. Chapter 9. Duke or No Duke. "I tell you, Arthur, if you don't produce Tessa at once, you can forget about there being any cordial relations between us for the rest of our lives." And once again, Edward, I had nothing to do with Miss Teresa's disappearance. She was here one moment and gone the next. Why don't you ask her family? Edward was barely holding on to his temper, and his flashing eyes warned his cousin that he was dealing with someone he really didn't know. "Her family is convinced that you have something to do with her disappearance, seeing as you went to great lengths to ensure that she knew all about June and the informal agreement between our families. Why you had to go and tell her all that is quite beyond me. I told you I would meet June just to make you happy, and nothing else. Yet you went and told my love that I was supposed to marry the woman. The 2 men were in Arthur's study, and Edward hadn't sat down at all. I'm not interested in marrying June or any other woman who isn't Tessa, and I'm giving you 24 hours to produce Tessa, or else this side of England will know that a madman with French blood running through his veins is present in this country." "Edward, calm down." "Calm down? Did you just tell me to calm down after all you've done to ruin my relationship with Tessa? Her twin sister is weeping and inconsolable, and her parents are out of their minds with anxiety. They're all blaming me, and you can dare tell me to calm down. I'm the head of this family, and you'll do well to listen to what I have to say." Edward's response was to raise his eyebrows at his cousin. "You think that just because you're a duke you can order me around. For your information, I'm also a duke and we're peers, so there. Try anything and you'll be sorry that we share the same blood and are like brothers even though we didn't grow up together. I'm leaving to find Tessa, and once I do, you can be sure that we're coming back here married. And I've just thought about this. I'll hold on to our grandfather's title just to spite you," he snarled at his cousin, before giving him a scathing look and leaving the study. He was enraged because he felt quite helpless. All his life, he'd been used to controlling whatever happened and not knowing where Tessa was, and if she was all right was driving him crazy with worry. What could have happened to her? "My word, I don't believe that you're a duke, dear Edward." Francis Drake's merry laughter was a balm to Edward's wounded heart. How did this all come about? The 2 men were walking around the vast, well-manicured garden. Frank's appearance, though a surprise, had greatly pleased Edward, and he finally felt that he could pour out his heart to one who understood him. So Edward proceeded to tell his friend all that had transpired since they separated in Paris. Francis was actually his contact with the British Army, and the 2 men had mutual liking and respect for each other. Apart from being a lieutenant in the army, Frank was also a marquis, a title he kept under wraps so he could be treated just like any other ordinary soldier. "But I'm thinking about rejecting this title and leaving it to fade into obscurity," he concluded. "Why?" "It's brought me nothing but pain. According to some unwritten informal agreement, whoever becomes the Duke of Wendell should marry some earl's daughter in order to keep nobility in the lineage." "What about the young lady you wrote to me about?" "That's just it. She's not nobility, and according to my cousin, who is the head of the family, I can't marry her. What's worse, he's found a way of getting her out of the way, and I'm at my wit's end, for I have no idea of knowing where he could have taken her." Francis shook his head. "You shouldn't blame your cousin for the disappearance of your young lady." "Oh, but I do. Can you imagine Arthur had the effrontery and nerve to call Tessa and tell her that she wasn't good enough for me, and that I was going to marry some lady called June? Then I left for Northumberland, and in my absence, that man found a way of taking Tessa away from here. What if he's sent her to America or Australia?" Francis threw his head back and laughed. "Stop being so melodramatic, dear Edward. What if I tell you that I know where your Tessa is?" Edward gave him a sharp look. "Do you know something that I don't?" "If you would only calm down, I may be able to tell you where she is, or someone who looks very much like the person you described to me in the letter. Not many women in the world have golden hair and hazel eyes like you wrote about. You should think about becoming a poet, for you described her so." Vividly. The moment I saw her, I knew she was your Tessa because she told me her name, and I don't believe in coincidences. Fate put me in her path. You've really seen her. Would you take me to her? Edward was so excited that he looked like a small boy getting his first taste of candy, which brought a broad smile to Frank's face. Calm down first. I'll take you to her, but all in good time. Now why don't you let me meet your cousin, the other Duke? Some people have all the luck in the world. A family of dukes, Francis said, but without envy in his voice. He was really happy for his friend. Chapter 10. Home at last. Are you sure this is the place? Edward could barely sit still in his carriage. He didn't care that he was getting curious looks from passers-by and those at the Merry Widow's Inn. He was here on a mission, and he needed to accomplish it. Francis chuckled softly, shaking his head. If anyone had told me that I would one day see the great and mighty Edward Gillen brought to his knees by a mere filly, I would have said they were mad. Please don't joke about this. Your mother will be greatly delighted to hear that you've finally succumbed to the matters of the heart and are just as fallible as the rest of mankind. Is this the place? He asked, turning to study the courtyard. Never mind. It is, Edward said, and stepped out of the carriage. Tessa had just finished cleaning the small area in front of the courtyard when she became aware of someone bearing down on her. She wasn't scared because her two burly cousins were just a shout away, but when she looked up, her feet froze on the ground. My darling Edward didn't wait but immediately cupped her face in both hands. You've given me many days of worry, not to mention what your flight has done to your parents. Edward, she said breathlessly, what are you doing here? She looked over her shoulder and saw Francis observing them with a half smile on his face. Do you know him? He was here at the inn a few days ago and was looking at me very strangely. Is he your friend? Yes, Francis is my very good friend. He's the one who told me where to find you. How did he know me? I've written to him so many times about you, so when he saw you, he decided that either you had a look-alike or you were the same person. When he got to Pentonville and I told him about your disappearance, he immediately offered to bring me to you. Why have you come, and where is Lady June, the noble woman you're betrothed to? She should be at her father's home if I'm not wrong. What made you run away from me like that, my love? He took her hands, and even though she tried to get away, he wouldn't let go. From his peripheral vision, he noticed two huge men stepping out of the inn and coming towards them. Little cousin, is this man bothering you? Edward let go of Tessa's hands to brace himself for any onslaught that might come. He also noticed that Francis' hand adopted an alert stance, feeling glad that his friend had his back. The men standing before him didn't seem like the kind to take kindly to anyone bullying their cousin, and he was glad that Tessa had had sufficient protection in the days she'd been here. But he was here to take her back home, for he wasn't letting her out of his sight ever again. Hans, this is Lord Edward Gillen, the Duke of Wendell. Lord Edward, these are my dear cousins Hans and Graber. Germans, Edward found himself asking. My aunt was married to a German, but when he died, she decided to return home with her children. She bought this inn and now runs it with the help of my cousins. Little Tessa, is this man going to be a problem? No, he's my friend, so you can go in and tell Aunt Janet that she doesn't need to heat the skillet. The two men guffawed, but went back into the inn without further protest. Edward was glad they had decided to trust him with their cousin. Tessa turned to Edward. My aunt believes that the best weapon that a woman can have is a hot skillet. Mercifully, I'm not her enemy, but neither am I just your friend. He gave her an intense look and she blushed. Tessa, I want to marry you and would have done so, but you ran away. He took her hand. She tried to pull away, but he held fast. You're a nobleman and I'm a commoner. So? The two don't mix, and I didn't want you to give up your title for me. You owe it to your ancestors to carry the name forward. Edward shook his head. I don't owe anyone anything, especially not if it will interfere with my love for you. My mind is still made up that should anyone stop me from marrying you, I would rather abdicate than take a title just so I can marry a woman I don't love. You shouldn't say that. My intentions of coming here to find you were to ask you to come to Gretna Green with me. Let's elope right now, my darling. I don't want to spend another day without you. Edward, Tessa protested softly. Don't you want to marry me? I do, more than anything, but elopement isn't the answer. My cousin, as the trustee of the duchy, won't give his permission, and I'm not ready to lose you. After all, I've grown up all my life without knowing that I was related to any nobles at all, and this doesn't in any way change how I feel about you. I love you so much, Tessa, and if I can't marry you, then I don't want the duchy. Please don't say that. Many people are counting on you to take the title. Be that as it may, my heart also comes first, and so do you. Without you then, I would just rather return to Paris and let Napoleon's men find me and do whatever they want with me. Didn't you hear? Hear what? Edward frowned slightly. Napoleon was defeated by the 7th Coalition Army led by Lord Arthur, the Duke of Wellington, and is now in St. Helena. I doubt that he can cause any trouble any more while over there. We get a lot of news from people travelling through here. I would rejoice, but my first allegiance is to you. Tessa, will you be my wife? That's the only thing that matters to me right now. Tessa thought about the sadness she'd experienced in the past few weeks and how she'd longed for Edward to come to her. He was here now, and she knew what she must do. I love you and would absolutely love to be your wife, but your cousin won't let us, at least not right away. That's the reason I want to go to Gretna with you. Once we're married, no one can stand in our way, and I don't have to depend on the duchy to survive. The regent sent for me a few days before Francis came, and I was honoured and paid some very good money for my service to the crown. If I can't be duke, I can buy us a small cottage and we can retire there and just be happy together. I have this feeling that your cousin will come around and allow us to get married. Let's not lose hope. Edward wanted to argue, but the look of determination on Teresa's face made him sigh inwardly. She apparently had more faith than him. I'll accept your terms if you'll return to Pentonville with me. She smiled so sweetly at him. Most certainly, but also if you'll accept your title and settle down. After all, being called Duchess has a certain appeal. There was a twinkle in her eyes that made her words harmless. A few days ago, June had said the same words, and it had irked him greatly, but not with Tessa. She was the kindest and gentlest woman he'd met, and she truly loved him for himself, not just because he was a duke. I will enjoy having you beside me, my Duchess. He raised her hand to his lips. Now, would you introduce me to the rest of your angry relatives who are glaring at me through the window? Tessa giggled as she nodded and turned to enter the inn, still holding his hand. So, did he propose? Tamara, you know that he did that weeks ago, but I refused him. What happened with you then? I was half afraid that you might get it into your heads to find your way to Gretna Green. It was a very enticing thought, but then I realised that it would be immature, just what I didn't want Lord Arthur accusing me of being. So we're going to continue loving each other and praying that Arthur will change his mind and allow us to get married. Have no fear, dear sister. A certain look that frightened Tessa came into Tamara's eyes. Whenever her sister got that look, something terrible was about to happen. Tamara, please promise me that you won't kidnap the Duke or do something equally drastic to get him to change his mind about us. You're my big sister by a few minutes, and I know you mean well, but this is something that Edward and I are going to have to work through. I don't know what you mean, because I have no intention of kidnapping the Duke or anyone else. You always read too much into the things I do. That's because I know you so well, Tamara. Promise me that you'll stay out of this. If you say so. She dismissed unconvincingly, and Tessa sighed within. Her sister was one of the most difficult people to deal with. When she'd made her mind up about something, she just hoped Tamara wouldn't do anything that would get her into deep trouble. A horse neighed softly and Tessa smiled, standing up from the kitchen table. That must be Edward. He said he would come by. Run along, child. Tamara shooed her towards the door. You don't want to keep a duke waiting. With a final smile and small wave, Tessa left her sister. Edward was standing beside the horse, a pretty little mare. What's going on? Please don't tell me you rode on this poor animal. You're too heavy for her. Oh, I didn't ride on her, but walked her all this way. Why? Because she's my present to you. What? Tessa covered her mouth with her hands. Oh, Edward, this is too much for me. Nothing is good enough for my beloved. Now say you'll accept her. I'd love to, but where would I stable her? Arthur agreed to allow you to use his stables. He did? Edward nodded. Yes, indeed. I'm going to have fun turning you into as good a horsewoman as your sister. Besides, this mare is so gentle and there's no fear of you falling off. But promise me that you won't ever ride out alone. I promise. Tessa touched her horse's muzzle and made small sounds that brought out a soft neigh. She likes you already. What will you call her? Glorious, Tessa said unhesitatingly. Growing up, she and Tamara had yearned to have their own horses, and she'd always said that she would name hers Glorious. Thank you so much, Edward. She left the horse and moved to his side. You make me so happy that sometimes I feel that I'm dreaming. You deserve to be happy, my darling. Now please tell me again how much you love me, for I'm dying to do the same. I love you more than the stars in the sky, more than the sun on its hottest day, and more than the huge waves of the ocean. And I love you more than all the beautiful sounds made by birds in the spring, more than all the snow in winter, and more than all the trees that grow in England. As the couple were lost in their own world, inside the cottage, Tamara watched them with a determined look in her eyes. Her sister and Edward would be married and live in wedded bliss for the rest of their lives, and she would see to it that it happened sooner rather than later. She had work to do, and even if it was the last thing she ever did, she would ensure they got married.
The end. Thank you for listening. Here at Pure Read, we aim to serve you, our dear readers and listeners, with good, clean Christian stories. You can be assured that any Pure Read book you pick up will not only be hugely enjoyable but free of any objectionable content. We are deeply thankful to you for choosing our books. Your support means that we can continue to provide stories like the one you have just listened to. Please like and subscribe to our channel. That way you'll be the first to hear when new stories arrive for your enjoyment. To browse our range of clean and wholesome titles, go to pureread.com. God bless you and thank you again for listening.